In the summer of 1980, a Soviet family boarded a train to Sochi for what should have been the vacation of a lifetime. Within 3 months, Lev Orlov would be convicted and sentenced to death. His wife would be sent to a labor camp. Their 14-year-old son would be placed in a state institution. And 4 years later, a railway worker would find the boy's frozen body beneath a bridge. 3 lives destroyed, a family erased, all because of one conversation that took place on a fateful evening on a balcony overlooking the Black Sea. The Soviet Union in 1980 was a nation caught between its revolutionary past and an uncertain future. Leonid Brezhnev, aging and increasingly frail, presided over what historians would later call the era of stagnation, a period marked by economic decline, political rigidity, and a pervasive culture of surveillance that touched every aspect of daily life. The KGB, the Committee for State Security, had grown into a vast apparatus, with informants embedded in every workplace, every apartment block, every social circle. Trust was a luxury few could afford, yet most people, through a combination of habit and necessity, continued to live as though their neighbors, colleagues, and even casual acquaintances could be counted on. This contradiction, the need to trust in a society built on suspicion, would prove fatal for the Orlov family. Sverdlovsk, located on the eastern slope of the Ural Mountains, was one of the Soviet Union's most important industrial centers, a city of approximately 1 million people that had been off-limits to foreigners since the 1940s due to its concentration of military production facilities. The city produced tanks, armored components, artillery systems, and other strategic military hardware, its factories operating around the clock in service of Soviet military and industrial might. The workers who powered these factories lived in concrete apartment blocks that stretched for kilometers, neighborhoods that looked identical to one another, differentiated only by the numbers painted on their buildings. It was a city built for function rather than beauty, where the sky was perpetually gray and where the sense of being watched, monitored, evaluated by unseen authorities was simply part of the texture of daily life. Lev Orlov was 39 years old in the summer of 1980, a hydraulic systems engineer at Uralmash, the Ural heavy machine building plant, one of the largest industrial complexes in the Soviet Union. He had joined the Communist Party in 1968, not out of ideological fervor, but because party membership was effectively mandatory for anyone seeking advancement in technical fields. His personnel file described him as reliable, skilled, and politically neutral, the kind of man who attended party meetings without enthusiasm but also without complaint, who voted as expected and kept his personal opinions to himself. His wife, Raisa, was 37, a librarian at the city's central library who specialized in technical literature and who possessed, according to friends, a quiet warmth and a talent for making their small apartment feel like a refuge, despite its institutional gray walls and the constant noise from neighboring units. Their son Timour was 14, a thoughtful boy who excelled in physics and who had recently been accepted into a specialized mathematics program, a significant achievement that suggested a promising future. The Olavs were not dissidents. By all accounts, they were ordinary Soviet citizens navigating the compromises and small hypocrisies required to maintain a decent life in a system that demanded conformity. This ordinariness is important because what happened to them could have happened to anyone, and that realization haunted those who knew them afterwards. In early June, Lev received notification through his factory's trade union that his family had been allocated 2 weeks at a workers' resort in Sochi, a Black Sea coastal town that served as the unofficial summer capital of the Soviet elite, and, during designated periods, offered subsidized vacations to deserving workers and their families. The allocation was something of a surprise. The waiting list for Black Sea resorts typically stretched for years, but Lev's supervisor explained that a family had cancelled due to a medical emergency, and Lev's clean record and recent work on improving hydraulic systems for industrial presses had put him at the top of the alternate list. Raisa was delighted. Timour, who had never seen the sea, could barely contain his excitement. They would leave on July 18th and return on August 1st. 2 weeks of sunshine, swimming, and the kind of leisure that was rare in their structured, work-dominated lives. The Olavs arrived in Sochi after a 48-hour train journey from Sverdlovsk. The resort itself was a sprawling complex of 3-story buildings arranged around a central dining hall, with a rocky beach accessed by a steep path lined with cypress trees. The rooms were simple but clean, each furnished with 2 narrow beds, a wardrobe, and a small balcony overlooking either the sea or the parking lot. The Orlovs were assigned a sea view room on the 2nd floor of Building D, a placement that felt like a good omen. Their first evening was spent exploring the grounds, eating a late dinner of soup and black bread in the communal dining hall, and standing on their balcony watching the sun set over the water in shades of orange and pink that seemed impossibly vivid compared to the perpetual grey of Sverdlovsk. On their second day, they met the Volkovs. It happened at the beach, where Timour, attempting to skip a stone across the water, accidentally struck a boy roughly his own age who was swimming nearby. The boy emerged from the water, laughing, not hurt, and his father, a man in his late 30s with an athletic build and an easy smile, waved off Timour's apologies and suggested that maybe the boys should swim together rather than engaging in stone warfare. His name was Fodor Volkov, and within minutes, his warm, engaging manner had put the entire Orlov family at ease. His wife, Oksana, was quieter but friendly, a slender woman with observant eyes who seemed content to let her husband dominate the conversation. They had 2 children, a son named Pavel, who was 13, and a daughter named Katya, who was 9. The families spent the rest of the afternoon together, swimming, building sandcastles with the younger children, and eventually sharing a late lunch at one of the resort's outdoor tables. What the Orlovs did not know, could not have known, was that Fyodor Volkov was a lieutenant colonel in the KGB's 2nd Chief Directorate, the branch responsible for internal counterintelligence and surveillance of Soviet citizens. His presence at the resort was not part of any official assignment. He and his family were genuinely on vacation, allocated their spot through the KGB's internal benefit system, which ensured that security service personnel received priority access to desirable vacation facilities as a perk of service. Fyodor was not there to monitor anyone. He was not compiling reports or cultivating sources. He was simply a father, enjoying 2 weeks at the beach with his family, grateful for a break from the demands of his work in Moscow, where he managed a team responsible for identifying ideological subversion among the scientific and technical intelligentsia. But KGB officers did not stop being KGB officers simply because they were on vacation. The training, the instincts, the habit of listening for signs of disloyalty or ideological unreliability, these were not things that could be switched off. Fyodor Volkov had spent 15 years learning to read people, to identify vulnerabilities, to recognize patterns of speech and behavior that indicated potential threats to Soviet power. And so even while he was relaxing at the beach, playing with his children, enjoying Georgian wine on a balcony overlooking the Black Sea, part of his mind remained active, observant, cataloguing and assessing the people around him. The two families fell into an easy companionship over the following days. They swam together in the cold, clear water. They took long walks along the coastal path that wound through pine forests and offered stunning views of the coastline. They shared meals and played cards in the evenings after the children had gone to bed. Lev found Fyodor remarkably easy to talk to, an attentive listener who seemed genuinely interested in Lev's work at Uralmash, in the technical challenges of designing hydraulic systems for industrial machinery, in the frustrations of working with outdated equipment and inadequate materials. Fyodor presented himself as a regional industrial administrator from Moscow, a vague designation that covered countless positions in the Soviet bureaucracy and that required no detailed explanation. Raisa, usually reserved with strangers, found herself chatting with Oksana about books, about raising children, about the small joys and large frustrations of Soviet domestic life. It was on the evening of July 25th that Lev made his first mistake. The four adults were sitting on the Olavs balcony, finishing a bottle of Armenian cognac that Fyodor had brought from a specialty store in Moscow. The conversation had turned, as it often did, among Soviet citizens, relaxing away from the usual constraints of work and neighborhood surveillance to the frustrations of daily life, the endless lines for basic goods, the dysfunction of the planned economy, the sense that while the leadership in Moscow lived in comfort, ordinary people struggled with shortages that seemed to worsen each year. This was familiar territory, the kind of complaints that were technically illegal but so universal that no one really believed they would lead to consequences. Lev, loosened by the cognac, began talking about a recent incident at Uralmash, where a shipment of precision valves had arrived from a supplier, only to be discovered as unusable due to manufacturing defects. The valves had to be discarded, production was delayed, and yet no one was held accountable because the supplier was managed by the brother-in-law of a regional party official. This kind of story was common, and Fyodor listened with the sympathetic attention of someone who understood bureaucratic incompetence firsthand. But then Lev, perhaps emboldened by Fyodor's receptiveness and the comfortable atmosphere of the evening, went further. He said that the real problem was not just inefficiency, but the entire system, the way political loyalty trumped competence at every level, the way criticism was impossible because anyone who pointed out obvious problems was labeled unreliable or worse. He mentioned that he had a colleague who had spent time in East Germany as a technical consultant and who had described how even there, in another socialist country, the factories operated more efficiently because their managers were selected based on ability rather than party connections. Lev said that sometimes he wondered whether the promises that had been made during the revolution, the promises of a workers' paradise where labor would be valued and everyone would share in prosperity, had actually been fulfilled, or whether they lived in something else entirely, a system where a small elite controlled everything while claiming to represent the masses. Then Lev made a joke. He said that Brezhnev himself was the perfect symbol of Soviet decline. An old man who could barely speak coherent sentences, being propped up and paraded before the world as a leader, and that the real tragedy was not that Brezhnev was failing, but that the entire system was designed to prevent anyone from acknowledging it or doing anything about it. He laughed as he said this, and Raisa, sensing danger, laughed too and tried to change the subject. There was a brief, heavy silence. Fyodor smiled, nodded, made a mild comment about how everyone had complaints about leadership, mentioned some bureaucratic frustration of his own that he framed as equally critical, and the conversation moved on to safer topics. But something had shifted. Raisa noticed that Fyodor seemed to be watching Lev more carefully for the rest of the evening, and that Oksana had gone quiet, her earlier warmth replaced by a kind of professional distance. When the Volkovs left to return to their own room around midnight, the goodbyes felt slightly formal, slightly forced. Lev woke the next morning with a hangover and a sick feeling in his stomach that had nothing to do with alcohol. He remembered what he had said, remembered the joke about Brezhnev, and felt a wave of cold fear. Raisa, lying next to him, said quietly that he had been careless, that he should not have spoken so freely with people they barely knew. Lev agreed, but told himself that surely nothing would come of it, that everyone made such comments in private, that Fyodor had seemed sympathetic rather than offended. They decided to maintain their distance from the Volkovs for the remainder of the vacation, to be polite but not seek out their company. But the damage, though they did not yet understand its extent, was already done. Fyodor Volkov spent that morning sitting on his own balcony while his family was at breakfast, smoking a cigarette and thinking about what he had heard the previous evening. He was on vacation. He was not obligated to file reports about casual conversations with strangers at a resort. But the comments Lev had made stuck with him. Criticism of the planned economy could be dismissed as normal grumbling. Comparisons to East Germany were borderline but not necessarily serious. But directly mocking Brezhnev by name, questioning the legitimacy of Soviet leadership, and suggesting that the revolution's promises had been betrayed. These were not minor complaints. These were indicators of what the KGB categorized as ideologically hostile views, and Fyodor's training, his career, his entire professional identity were built around identifying and neutralizing such views before they could spread and cause harm. He took no pleasure in the idea of ruining a family's life over drunken comments. But he also understood that the stability of the Soviet system depended on identifying and removing elements that pose threats to ideological unity, and that someone with Lev's views, someone working in a critical industrial facility with access to sensitive production processes and contact with hundreds of other workers, was exactly the kind of risk that could not be ignored. If Lev was willing to make such comments to a near stranger at a resort, what might he say to his colleagues at Uralmash? What influence might he have on younger engineers who looked up to him? And if Fyodor failed to report this, and it later came to light that he had been aware of anti-Soviet agitation and done nothing, his own career and possibly his freedom would be at risk. The KGB did not tolerate officers who covered up ideological crimes, even on vacation. That day, Fyodor excused himself from a beach outing by claiming a headache, and instead went to the resort's administrative office, where he identified himself to the manager as a KGB officer and requested use of the secure telephone line that all Soviet resort facilities were required to maintain for official communications. He placed a call to his superior in Moscow, explained the situation, and received instructions to file a detailed written report upon his return. Fyodor spent the next 2 hours in the manager's office writing a comprehensive account of his conversations with Lev Orlov, including the specific comments about party corruption, comparisons to East Germany, criticism of Brezhnev, and the broader pattern of ideological unreliability that these comments suggested. He included Lev's personal details, full name, place of residence, place of employment, which Lev had mentioned during their conversations. He noted that Orlov appeared to have access to sensitive industrial information and contact with foreign technical consultants, which increased the potential security risk. He concluded by recommending that the Sverdlovsk office of the KGB open an investigation into Orlov's activities, associations, and ideological reliability. The vacation ended on August 1st as planned. The Olavs and Volkovs maintained a polite distance during the final days, exchanging brief greetings when they encountered each other, but no longer spending significant time together. If Lev and Raisa found this odd, they attributed it to the natural cooling of vacation friendships as people began thinking about their return to normal life. The families did not exchange addresses. They did not promise to stay in touch. They simply parted ways at the resort's front entrance, the Volkovs loading into a car that would take them to a different train station, the Orlovs boarding a bus to begin their long journey back to Sverdlovsk. Timour asked his parents why they had stopped seeing the Volkovs, and Raisa told him that sometimes people just run out of things to talk about, which was not exactly a lie, but not exactly the truth either. The Orlov family arrived back in Sverdlovsk on August 3rd. Sunburned and exhausted from the train journey, Lev returned to work at Uralmash on August 5th, resuming his usual routine of reviewing engineering specifications and supervising hydraulic system installations. Everything seemed normal. The days passed without incident. Raisa returned to the library. Timour prepared for the start of school. The vacation became a pleasant memory, slightly tainted by the awkwardness with the Volkovs, but otherwise a highlight of their summer. But in Moscow, Fyodor Volkov's report had made its way through KGB channels to the Second Chief Directorate's section, responsible for monitoring the Sverdlovsk region, and from there to the Sverdlovsk regional headquarters of the KGB. On August 14th, a major named Gennady Karpov, who specialized in counterintelligence operations targeting the industrial sector, read through Volkov's report with increasing interest. The criticism of the party, the mockery of Brezhnev, the comparison to foreign countries, individually, these might have been dismissed as minor grumbling. But together, and coming from someone working at a facility as sensitive as Uralmash, they represented a potential security threat that warranted investigation. Karpov authorized what the KGB called a razrabotka, a development which meant the opening of a formal investigation into Lev Orlov. This investigation would involve surveillance, interviews with colleagues and neighbors, examination of Lev's personnel file and party records, monitoring of his communications, and, if necessary, the recruitment of informants within his social circle. The goal was to determine whether Lev's comments indicated deeper dissent, whether he had connections to dissident networks, and whether he posed a security risk that required neutralization. Most investigations concluded with the determination that the subject was harmless, perhaps indiscreet, but not dangerous, and resulted in nothing more than a note in the person's file. But sometimes, an investigation uncovered additional evidence that transformed careless comments into serious crimes against the state. The first sign that something was wrong came on August 22nd, when Lev was called into the office of Uralmash's party secretary, a stern man named Valentin Morozov, who had always been distant and formal. Morozov began the meeting by asking Lev about his vacation, how his family had enjoyed Sochi, whether the resort had met expectations. Lev, confused by the unexpected attention, answered politely, describing the vacation as excellent and expressing gratitude for the opportunity. Morozov nodded, made notes, and then asked whether Lev had met anyone interesting during his stay. Lev hesitated, uncertain how to answer, and finally mentioned the Volkov family, describing them as pleasant people they had spent some time with. Morozov asked what they had discussed, and Lev, feeling trapped, offered vague responses about the weather, their children, general vacation topics. Morozov wrote everything down, thanked Lev for his time, and dismissed him. Lev left the meeting deeply unsettled. That evening, he told Raisa about the conversation, and they both understood immediately that something was happening, that their interaction with the Volkovs had somehow been reported. Raisa asked whether Lev thought Fyodor might have been KGB, and Lev said he did not know, but that it would explain everything. The questions about his work, the interest in his opinions, the sudden coldness after that final conversation on the balcony. They discussed what to do, whether Lev should go to the party secretary and explain that his comments had been exaggerated by alcohol and did not reflect genuine anti-Soviet sentiment. But they decided that drawing more attention to the situation might make things worse, that perhaps the investigation would conclude that Lev was politically naive, but not dangerous, and that the best course of action was to remain quiet and hope the matter would be dropped. But the investigation was not dropped. Over the following weeks, KGB officers interviewed Lev's colleagues at Uralmash, asking carefully worded questions about his political reliability, whether he had ever expressed anti-Soviet views, whether he had contacts with foreigners or seemed interested in foreign countries. Most of his colleagues, not wanting to create problems for themselves, offered neutral responses or claimed to know nothing about Lev's political views. But one colleague, a man named Stepan with whom Lev had worked for nearly a decade, mentioned that Lev had once complained about the quality of Soviet machine tools and said that foreign equipment was superior. Stepan framed this as an innocent observation, a technical assessment rather than political criticism. But the KGB officer who interviewed him recorded it as evidence of anti-Soviet sentiment and preference for Western systems. The KGB also interviewed the Olavs' neighbors in their apartment building, asking similar questions. An elderly woman who lived across the hall mentioned that she had sometimes heard Lev and Raisa discussing shortages and expressing frustration about the difficulty of obtaining basic goods. A younger couple on the floor below mentioned that Lev had once made a sarcastic comment about party officials having access to special stores while ordinary people waited in lines. These were the kind of comments that millions of Soviet citizens made every day, but in the context of a KGB investigation, they were catalogued as evidence of systematic anti-Soviet attitudes. The most damaging information came from an unexpected source. During a routine review of personnel files at Uralmash as part of the investigation, KGB officers discovered that Lev had, in 1976, submitted a proposal to factory management suggesting that certain production processes could be improved by adopting methods used in West German industrial plants. The proposal had been rejected at the time on the grounds that Soviet methods were adequate and that excessive interest in foreign practices was ideologically questionable. The proposal itself had been forgotten, buried in administrative files, but the KGB retrieved it and interpreted it as evidence that Lev had been fascinated with Western systems for years, that his comments in Sochi were not isolated incidents but part of a long-standing pattern of ideological unreliability. By mid-September, the KGB had assembled what they considered a compelling case. Lev Orlov had directly criticized Soviet leadership, questioned the achievements of the revolution, praised foreign systems, and demonstrated a pattern of anti-Soviet thinking extending back several years. The fact that he worked in a sensitive industrial facility and had contact with hundreds of other workers made him particularly dangerous. A decision was made at the regional level that Lev represented a threat that required removal. On September 18, 1980, Lev Orlov was arrested. It happened at the factory, mid-morning, as Lev was conducting a routine inspection of hydraulic systems in one of the production halls. Two men in civilian clothes approached him, identified themselves as state security officers, and informed him that he was required to come with them for questioning. Lev asked what this was about, whether he could contact his wife. The officers told him that all questions would be answered at their facility and that he needed to come immediately. Lev was escorted through the factory floor, past colleagues who stopped their work to watch in silence, and driven to the Sverdlovsk headquarters of the KGB, a grey concrete building in the city centre. The interrogation began that afternoon and continued, with breaks only for minimal food and sleep for the next 5 days. Lev was not physically tortured. By 1980, the KGB had largely moved away from the brutal methods of the Stalin era, but psychological pressure was applied systematically and relentlessly. He was questioned by multiple officers working in shifts, each asking variations of the same questions. What did you say to Fyodor Volkov in Sochi? Why did you criticize Comrade Brezhnev? Why did you praise West German industrial methods? Who else shares your anti-Soviet views? What contacts do you have with foreign nationals? Why did you remove restricted documents from Uralmash? What did you plan to do with those specifications? Did you intend to share them with foreign engineers or Western publications? Lev denied being anti-Soviet. He admitted making careless comments in Sochi, but insisted they had been exaggerations influenced by alcohol, that he did not genuinely believe the Soviet system was flawed, that he was loyal to the state and the party. He admitted taking work documents home, but insisted it was only to complete projects on time, that he had never intended to share them with anyone, that he had not even realized this was a serious violation. But the interrogators rejected every explanation. They told him they had evidence of systematic anti-Soviet activity extending back years. They showed him his 1976 proposal about West German industrial methods and asked why he was so interested in foreign systems. They showed him the copied specifications found in his desk and asked why he had made unauthorized copies of restricted documents, if not to share them with someone. They read him statements from colleagues and neighbors describing his complaints about shortages and party privilege. They told him that mocking the General Secretary of the Communist Party was a serious crime, that expressing doubts about the revolution constituted anti-Soviet agitation, that unauthorized possession of restricted technical documents from a defense facility was espionage-adjacent behavior, and that he was facing charges under Article 64 of the RSFSR Criminal Code, which carried the death penalty. The interrogators pushed him to confess not just to the comments in Sochi, but to broader anti-Soviet activity. They wanted him to name other people who shared his views, to identify colleagues at Uralmash who had expressed similar opinions, to admit to being part of a network of ideologically hostile elements. Lev insisted there was no network, that his comments had been isolated and foolish, but not part of any organized dissent. The interrogators did not believe him, or perhaps they believed him, but needed him to confess to something more serious to justify the resources that had been invested in the investigation. On the 4th day of interrogation, an officer named Karpov, who appeared to be senior to the others, entered the room and sat down across from Lev. Karpov spoke quietly, almost kindly, and explained that Lev's situation was very serious. He said that Article 70 prosecutions for anti-Soviet agitation typically resulted in 8 to 10-year sentences, but that there were provisions under Article 64 for treason that carried far more severe penalties, including death. He said that Lev's work at Uralmash gave him access to sensitive military-industrial information, and that mocking the General Secretary while possessing such access, combined with his documented interest in Western systems and his proposal to adopt foreign methods, could be interpreted as ideological subversion intended to weaken Soviet defense capacity. This, he explained, could fall under the definition of treason. He let this sink in, watching Lev's face carefully, and then said that which article was applied would depend partly on how the case was presented to prosecutors in Moscow and partly on Lev's willingness to acknowledge the seriousness of his crimes and demonstrate genuine remorse. Lev, exhausted and terrified, understood what was being offered. If he confessed to serious anti-Soviet activity, if he acknowledged that his crimes were worse than he had initially admitted, the charges might remain under Article 70 rather than being escalated to treason. But if he continued to minimize what he had done, to insist that his comments had been meaningless, the charges could be upgraded and he could face execution. It was not a real choice. Lev signed a confession stating that he had engaged in systematic anti-Soviet agitation, that he had deliberately praised Western systems to undermine confidence in Soviet socialism, and that he took full responsibility for his ideologically hostile actions. The confession was false, but it was also his only chance of survival, or so he believed. Raisa learned of Lev's arrest when 2 KGB officers arrived at their apartment and informed her that her husband was being held for investigation into anti-Soviet activity. They told her she was not permitted to contact him, that she should not discuss his case with anyone, and that they would be conducting a search of the apartment. Raisa, stunned and terrified, could only nod. Timour, who had been doing homework in his room, came out to see what was happening and was ordered to sit on the couch and remain silent while the search was conducted. The officers went through every drawer, every bookshelf, every piece of paper. They confiscated Lev's personal notebooks, which contained technical calculations and work notes. They took Raisa's library of books, which included Russian classics and foreign literature that the library had officially acquired, but that the KGB now deemed suspicious. They took Timour's school books and examined them, page by page, looking for hidden notes. The search took 3 hours. When the officers left, they warned Raisa not to discuss her husband's case and told her that someone would contact her regarding her own status. The impact on the family was immediate and total. Raisa went to the library the next morning and was called into the director's office, where she was informed that due to her husband's arrest on charges of anti-Soviet activity, she was being placed on indefinite leave pending review. The phrase was bureaucratic, but its meaning was clear. She was fired. Timour went to his school and found himself suddenly isolated. Friends who had been close the day before now avoided him in the hallways. Teachers who had praised his academic ability now looked at him with suspicion or pity. Within a week, he was called to the school administration and told that his placement in the specialized mathematics program was being revoked due to his family situation. Raisa tried desperately to find a lawyer who would represent Lev, but the few attorneys she contacted either refused outright or told her that in cases involving state security, defense was largely symbolic. One lawyer, speaking quietly in his office, told her that the best outcome she could hope for was that Lev would receive a prison sentence rather than something worse, and that she should prepare herself and her son for a long separation. Lev's trial took place on October 20th, 1980, in a closed session of the Sverdlovsk Regional Court. Closed sessions were standard in cases involving state security, ostensibly to protect classified information, but in practice to shield the judicial process from scrutiny. Raisa was not permitted to attend. Lev's court-appointed attorney met with him for 20 minutes before the trial began and advised him to plead guilty and express remorse. The prosecution presented its case, which consisted primarily of testimony from Fodor Volkov, who had traveled from Moscow to appear as a witness and who recounted Lev's comments with clinical precision, and statements from colleagues and neighbors describing Lev's ideological unreliability. Lev's signed confession was read into the record. His attorney made a brief statement noting that his client had no history of dissident activity and that the charges were based on private comments made during a vacation. The judge listened without expression and retired to deliberate. But when the judge returned 2 hours later, the verdict was far worse than anyone had expected. The prosecution, reviewing Lev's case in consultation with KGB officials in Moscow, had decided to pursue charges under Article 64, treason, rather than the lesser charge of anti-Soviet agitation. The justification was multifaceted. Lev's work at Uralmash gave him access to industrial processes and specifications related to defense production, including hydraulic systems used in military equipment. He had removed restricted technical documents from the facility without authorization and kept them in his home, a serious security breach. He had made unauthorized copies of specifications for armor plate production systems. He had expressed admiration for Western industrial methods and criticized Soviet leadership. The prosecution argued that these actions, taken together, constituted preparation for espionage, that Lev had been positioning himself to provide technical information to foreign entities, and that his criticism of the Soviet system, combined with his possession of restricted materials, demonstrated intent to betray his country. The fact that Lev had no actual contact with foreign intelligence services, had never attempted to pass information to anyone, and had simply been working from home and complaining while drunk, was deemed secondary to the pattern of behavior that suggested potential for treasonous action. Lev Orlov was found guilty of treason under Article 64 of the RSFSR Criminal Code. The sentence was death by firing squad. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Lev, who had been standing in the dock with slumped shoulders, stiffened as if he had been struck. His attorney sat motionless, offering no objection because there was no point in objection. The judge concluded the proceedings, and Lev was led away by guards. He would be permitted one final meeting with his wife before the sentence was carried out, and he would have the right to petition for clemency, though such petitions were almost never granted in treason cases. Raisa learned of the verdict when a KGB officer arrived at her apartment and informed her that her husband had been sentenced to death and that she was permitted to visit him once before the execution. She stood in the doorway, unable to speak, unable to process what she had just been told. Timour, overhearing from his room, began to scream. The officer, uncomfortable with the family's grief, handed Raisa a document with details about the visit and left quickly. The visit took place 2 days later, on October 22nd, in a small room at the detention facility attached to the KGB headquarters. Lev was brought in, wearing prison clothes, handcuffed, accompanied by 2 guards who stood by the door. He looked gaunt and exhausted, as though he had aged a decade in the month since his arrest. Raisa and Timour were allowed 30 minutes with him, though conversation was monitored and anything deemed inappropriate would result in the visit being terminated immediately. They sat across a table from each other, unable to touch because physical contact was prohibited. Lev tried to reassure them, tried to tell them he was sorry, that he had been foolish, that he had never imagined his stupid comments would lead to this. Raisa told him she loved him, that she would take care of Timour, that she would be strong. Timour could barely speak, could only sit there crying, while his father tried to comfort him through words that sounded hollow and inadequate. The 30 minutes passed in a blur of tears and useless reassurances, and then the guards told them time was up. Lev stood, looked at his wife and son one final time, and was led away. It was the last time they would ever see him. Lev filed a petition for clemency, a formality that his attorney told him had virtually no chance of success, but that was required procedure. The petition was reviewed by regional officials and forwarded to Moscow, where it was examined and rejected within 96 hours. No explanation was provided. The execution was scheduled for November 12th, approximately 3 weeks after the trial. Meanwhile, Raisa's own legal troubles were beginning. On October 25th, 3 days after her final visit with Lev, she was summoned to KGB headquarters and informed that she too was under investigation. The charge was failure to report anti-Soviet activity. The investigator, a cold woman in her 30s, explained that as Lev's wife, Raisa must have been aware of his ideological hostility, must have heard him make critical comments about the Soviet system, and had failed in her duty as a Soviet citizen to report him to authorities. Raisa protested that she had done nothing wrong, that Lev had occasionally complained about work frustrations like everyone did, that she had never imagined his complaints constituted criminal activity. The investigator told her that ignorance was not an excuse, that loyalty to the state superseded loyalty to family, and that her failure to report Lev's ideological unreliability made her complicit in his crimes. The legal basis for charging Raisa was questionable at best, but the KGB had decided that she represented a problem that needed to be addressed. She was a librarian with access to books and young readers, someone who could potentially spread her husband's anti-Soviet views to others. More importantly, she was a living reminder of the Orlov case, and the state preferred that reminders of such cases be removed from public view. Her trial took place on November 8, 1980, in another closed session that lasted less than 4 hours. She was found guilty of failure to report anti-Soviet activity and sentenced to 5 years in a corrective labor colony. The sentence was comparatively lenient, a reflection perhaps of the fact that the charges against her were thin even by Soviet standards, but it was still devastating. 5 years away from her son. 5 years in conditions that would test the limits of her endurance. Raisa was given 3 days to arrange for Timour's care, before she was to be transported to a women's labor camp in the Moldovan Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, approximately 1,000 kilometers to the west of Sverdlovsk. She had no family in the city who could take him. Her parents were dead, and Lev's family, scattered across different regions and terrified of being associated with a traitor's relatives, refused to help. On November 10th, a representative from the Ministry of Education arrived at the apartment and informed Raisa that Timour would be placed in State Children's Home No. 7 on the outskirts of Sverdlovsk until he reached the age of 16, at which point he would be considered legally independent and expected to support himself. The children's home was a grim 3-story brick building surrounded by a high fence, housing approximately 70 children, ranging in age from 7 to 16. Most were orphans or children whose parents had been deemed unfit, imprisoned, sent to psychiatric hospitals, stripped of parental rights for alcoholism or political crimes. The facility operated on a strict schedule, designed to produce obedient citizens who understood their place at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Wake at 6, breakfast at 7, school during the day, mandatory work duties in the afternoon, supervised study time until 8, lights out at 9. Deviation from the rules resulted in punishment, loss of meals, solitary confinement in a basement room, or in severe cases, transfer to a juvenile correctional facility. Timour arrived at the children's home on November 11th, carrying a single bag with his clothes and a few books his mother had been allowed to give him. He was assigned to a dormitory room with 9 other boys, given a narrow bed with a thin mattress, and issued institutional clothing. The director of the facility, a heavy-set woman named Ludmila, who seemed to regard the children as problems to be managed rather than young people to be cared for, told him the rules and warned him that the son of a traitor would receive no special consideration. If anything, he would be watched more carefully than the others. Timour was intelligent, sensitive, and utterly unprepared for the brutality of institutional life. Within days, he became a target for older boys who recognized vulnerability when they saw it. They stole his books, tore his clothes, beat him in the dormitory when the staff was not present. The adults who ran the facility showed little interest in protecting him or any of the children from one another. Violence among the residents was seen as natural, inevitable, a way for the stronger children to establish dominance and for the weaker ones to learn resilience, or at least submission. Timour tried to focus on his schoolwork, the one area where he had always excelled. But the school attached to the children's home was poorly equipped and staffed by teachers who had failed to secure positions elsewhere. The dream of attending a technical institute, of following his father into engineering, receded into impossibility. His future, to the extent that he had one, was limited to the margins of Soviet society. Letters from his mother arrived irregularly, sometimes 2 or 3 in a single week, sometimes nothing for a month. They were brief, heavily censored by prison authorities, with entire paragraphs blacked out. She told him she loved him, told him to be strong, told him to study and to remember that this situation was temporary, that she would be released in 1985 and they would be together again. But Timour could read between the lines, could sense the desperation and despair that she was trying to hide. And he knew, though neither of them acknowledged it in their letters, that even when she was released, even if they were reunited, their lives would never recover. By mid-December, he had begun sneaking out at night, climbing through a ground-floor window with a broken latch and disappearing into the industrial suburbs for hours. On January 15th, 1981, Timour left the children's home for the final time. He took nothing with him except the clothes he was wearing and a single photograph of his family taken the previous summer in Sochi before everything had fallen apart. He climbed through the window at 3 in the morning and walked into the darkness, with no plan and no destination, knowing only that he could not remain in that place any longer. The children's home filed a missing persons report, but the investigation was perfunctory. Runaway children from state institutions were common, and unless they committed serious crimes, the authorities had little interest in tracking them down. Timour's file was marked as absconded and placed in a cabinet with dozens of others. Raisa, in her labor camp in Mordovia, was never officially notified that her son had disappeared. What happened to Timour over the next years remains unclear. There were occasional unconfirmed sightings, rumors that filtered back to the children's home through other runaways who were eventually picked up by militia. Someone said they had seen him living with a group of street children near the railway yards. Someone else claimed he had been working at a construction site under a false name. A third report suggested he had been seen begging outside the central market. But none of these accounts were verified, and none led to his location. On November 18, 1984, a railway worker inspecting bridge supports along the river in southern Sverdlovsk discovered a body beneath one of the pylons. The deceased was a young man, approximately 18 or 19 years old, partially frozen, curled on his side on the concrete embankment. An empty vodka bottle lay beside him. The militia investigated briefly and determined that death had resulted from exposure and probable alcohol intoxication. No identification was found on the body. The remains were photographed, catalogued, and buried in an unmarked grave in the municipal cemetery. Raisa completed her 5-year sentence in November 1985 and returned to Sverdlovsk to find that everything she had left behind was gone. She went to the children's home to attempt to locate Timour, or where he might have gone upon release, and was told he had run away and had not been seen since. She went to the militia, who told her they had no information about his whereabouts. She searched for months, asking at homeless shelters and soup kitchens, checking hospitals and morgues, but found nothing. She never learned that he had died under the bridge, never learned that he was buried less than 5 kilometers from where she lived. On November 12, 1980, as scheduled, Lev Orlov was executed by firing squad at a facility outside Sverdlovsk. He was led into a courtyard shortly after dawn, his hands bound behind his back and positioned against a concrete wall. A 5-man firing squad stood 15 meters away. The officer in charge read the sentence aloud one final time, confirming that Lev had been found guilty of treason and that his petition for clemency had been denied. Lev was asked if he had any final words. He said only that he was sorry, though it was unclear whether he was apologizing to the state for his crimes or to his family for destroying their lives. The officer gave the command to fire. The sound echoed across the courtyard, and Lev Orlov collapsed. A doctor confirmed death, and the body was removed. According to standard procedure, Lev was buried in an unmarked grave in a restricted section of the municipal cemetery. The unmarked graves, where Lev and Timour are buried, are indistinguishable from hundreds of others, their identities lost in poorly maintained records. Raisa's grave has a simple marker with her name and dates, but no mention of her husband or son. Their story remains a testament to what was lost when a state prioritized ideology over humanity, when surveillance became so pervasive that friendship itself became dangerous. It serves as a reminder that the past is not abstract statistics, but an accumulation of individual tragedies, of families destroyed by systems that viewed them not as people, but as problems to be solved. And it stands as a warning about what happens when speaking freely becomes a capital crime, when trust becomes impossible, when even a vacation can be a death sentence.